Howdy, y'all. Good evening. This is Naeem Abul-Hawa, and I am ready to hopefully provide you guys with an interesting discussion today. So, yeah, without further ado, let's jump right in and get started. Thank you guys for joining me this evening. Howdy, y'all. Howdy. Good evening, everyone. Fellow GLOA 400 colleagues, peers, and everyone else who is going to consume this content. I am Naeem Abul-Hawa, and it's quite a pleasure to be with you all this evening. We will be discussing the Palestinian diaspora communities in Latin America. We will be focusing on particular examples and particular phases of, diaspora migration from Palestine to Latin America. But I think this is going to be a discussion that's going to spark all kinds of different emotions, motivations, inspirations, because it's not a black and white situation. It's not a one size fits all story. It's a story of perseverance, of traveling to a new land, of integrating into a new society, of learning a new language, of rediscovering your roots, of establishing communications between the nation you live in and your homeland, and keeping a link and keeping that link alive. And this is a story that spans almost 200 years. So I guess without further ado, let's dive right in and explore how Palestinian communities who or Palestinians who have migrated out of Palestine to Latin America impacted their host communities, how they have contributed to the fabric and the fold of the new societies they've moved into, and how they have given back to their homeland. So, we're going to be looking at a variety of different contexts. So let's start with a simple example. The Palestinian flag, or the flag of the Palestinian territories, is a beautiful green, white, red, and black. And inspiration was drawn upon by a foremost and leading football league, football as in soccer here in the United States, but elsewhere football, in Chile, in Santiago de Chile, I believe. And it is the Palestino Deportivo, the Palestine or Palestinian Football Club. And you could see that their emblem here is shares the same colors as the flag of Palestine. So I think this is just one example to highlight how the Palestinian community in Chile for many, many years built up a name for themselves, a positive reputation, influence in community, and really understood the significance of their roots, kind of displaying a sense of national identity or nationalism or unity, or tracing to their ancestry, but also being active participants in their new homeland in Chile, and understanding the importance of football in Chilean culture. That stuff is almost a religion over there. So it's quite nice to see the football team called Palestino Deportivo. So the Washington football team here in DC, I am a Washington fan, is American football, but they're looking for a new name. I don't know. Washington has a substantial Palestinian community too. What do you guys say? Okay, maybe I'm just crazy. But I think this is a drawing of global links. This demonstrates how the folks of Palestinian ancestry in Chile, the Chilean Palestinian community, establishes that global bridge. So I think we should establish an understanding here by looking a little bit at a map. This will be a map of the Lebanese diaspora to Latin America, or the Lebanese diaspora around the world, but I want to focus here on Latin America. So when the first waves of Arabs came to Latin America in a more general sense, They were Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian, predominantly Christians, leaving the Ottoman Empire during the economic downturn of the 1860s, 70s, and onward, and the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid Thani II, where there was a rediscovered Ottoman Islamic unity type of identity, and the Christian Arabs kind of felt a little out or a little lost. So they traveled. Many of them were told they were going to America, whether they had thought that was the United States or just the American continent, um, and ended up on the shores of Brazil, ended up on the shores of Central America, ended up in Argentina, and in Buenos Aires, and other places, modern day Uruguay, and those areas, and realized that they were in a new America. So the Lebanese Christian, Syrian Christian, and Palestinian Christian communities had a similar business models. They were going to be, merchants, salespeople, craftsmen, and they didn't want to compete against each other. So we saw that the Lebanese and Syrian communities settled on the eastern coast. We see a large Lebanese diaspora community in Sao Paulo and Santa Catarina and in southern Brazil. Brazil. And so the Palestinian communities traveled westwards through the Argentine Andes west, and found settlement in places like Western Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru. So this is why we will see that where the Lebanese Arab Christians have settled, Brazil, Ecuador, is not so much all the time where the Palestinian communities settled. This was in this first wave. Things start to change a little bit in future waves, but we see this in the first wave. Well, these Palestinian families, Lebanese and Syrian Christian families, really started to establish roots and integrate, or begin to integrate, in Latin American society. They were they were identified as others, and they were called Turcos. Turcos was referring to the Ottoman Turkish passports, nationality they held, being under Ottoman jurisdiction. And so Turcos at the time could have had a pejorative or almost offensive connotation, as they were trying to integrate into the societies there. So these Turcos, Arabes, they started to establish communities. Then in 1908, so in 1908, the communities started to establish roots, and we saw that. Reload. Address. Mail-attachment.googlesercontent.com. Pardon. Secure and validated connection. We saw that they started to, when the Young Turks Revolution happened, and the mandatory conscription happened in Ottoman lands, many of the Christian Arabs who still stayed in Bethlehem, for example, in Palestine, did not necessarily want to send their young sons off to fight the cause of a Muslim army, when they didn't feel like they were first-class citizens anyway in this society. Some Muslim Palestinians also tried to send some of their kids out to Latin America, but since they didn't have many of their communities established or economic ties to Latin America, it wasn't as successful for them as it was for the second wave of Christian Arabs. You will see that a lot of them come from places like Bet Sahur, Beit Jella and Beit Lahem in Palestine. This is predominantly the folks who find themselves in Chile, some people from Birzeit as well. But as we can see, there is different reports and different experiences from so many different researchers who have looked at this issue or this situation in Latin America. So as we'll pull up the biographies here, I want to start with Cecilia Baeza and looking at some of the concepts and topics that she really focuses on, and the interesting piece. So she has an academic piece, in her studies, titled, talking about between assimilation and long distance nationalism. Assimilation may carry a more crass tone than, say, integration, but how these Palestinian communities have integrated themselves into Chilean, Honduran, or Salvadoran society. Those are the three big countries where they're predominantly in: Chile, Honduras, and Salvador, for the Christian Arab waves that we were talking about just now. And how do they maintain this long distance nationalism? So she focuses on while their backstory, their first wave, they spent the time being craftsmen and salespeople, and frankly, any entrepreneurial efforts to, reload button, to make it work. Eventually, they had started to see an increase in their presence and their influence as their second and third generations really started to integrate themselves into societies, let's say Chile, for example, and start to become involved in the professional middle class, professional managerial class, the PMCs, and start owning their own textile factories, start owning lots of successful companies in these nations, in Bolivia, in Chile, and elsewhere, and started to gain prevalence. And then you had the other waves, other instances, as researched by Odette Yiri, who is a Palestinian Colombian professor, and she has studied and focused on the flip side of this. So while many Palestinians were seeing successful and smooth integration into their host countries and becoming very involved in the fabric, there were two paths that folks took. The first is the path that Odette Yiri focuses on in a discussion she gives at the museum for the Palestinian people, where she talks with an audience and explains how in Colombia, the Palestinian communities were sort of discouraged from really focusing on and discussing their roots, in that they sort of just had to become Colombian and be as Colombian as possible, and just Colombian, period, not Colombian Palestinian, right? And so this was something she realized in Colombia, though she also identified features of how you would find there's a town called Bancarilla. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, horribly wrong. Okay, so it's a town where you would see street vendors selling stuff like kibbe and falafel and these Arab traditional Palestinian delicacies, warak anib, alongside alongside empanadas, empanadas de crema, and all the other good treats they have in Colombia. And there was that feature. But for the most part, Palestinian Colombians don't really talk too much about their Palestinianness. While we saw very wealthy Palestinians involved in leadership in say Colombia. I know in Bancaria, the coat of arms was donated or designed by a substantial Palestinian businessman in the 1930s or 40s to give back to the Colombian community, but it's not talked about in common discourse, right? So, we see
address, reload, button.
Okay, so we see a lot of that happening in Colombia. Now we want to switch to a more, I don't want to use the word smooth integration example, but definitely an example of integration that seems to have been more inclusive, and that's the one of Chile with Marcelo Marzuga.
Address, reload, button.
Yeah. So Marcelo Marzuga is a sociologist and lawyer in Santiago de Chile, and he is also a lecturer and a partner in startups and dialogue between Chile and Palestine. And in Chile, the Palestinian community has been attempting to revive their Palestinian roots and be very involved in developing and cultivating a relationship between Chile and back home in Palestine. We'll see if we look at startups.
Toolbar, share.
Different startups in between Palestine and Latin America. A lot of them come out of Chile. And a specific example we can just glance at their site real quick is investpalestine.ps. And we see here in investpalestine.ps that there is an effort to link investments to startups, whether they're tech or otherwise, started by Palestinians back home in Bethlehem. Ensuring that there is opportunity and capital being flowing from those who have, achieved and earned, thankfully and humbly, success in Latin America, say Chile, and back home to their home, not just home country, but specifically their hometowns, Bethlehem, Beit Sahur, Beit Jella, and so on. Marcelo Marzuga does talk about specifically being from Beit Jella himself. So that's quite an interesting detail. I want to move now to the topic of political and cultural implications. And then after that, I want to move on to the current situation. So I think we should start by understanding or starting to look at really how the Arab diaspora, whether it's in its early waves of the 1860s or its more recent waves post-1948, how that has impacted the demographics, the ethnic makeup, and the cultural discussion and makeup of Latin America. So let's watch a quick clip here about the Arabs, the unspoken pillar of Latin American society.
Latin America is a fascinating society, being a hybrid of primarily European, Native American, and African genetics and culture, which has given the region its distinct identity today. Although many may have never realized this, very similarly to the United States, most Latin American countries are also a melting pot, deriving from dozens of different nations other than just Spain and Portugal, and perhaps even more so than the U.S. because of an even greater range and diversity for its gene pool, seeing the large ethnic population of Japanese, Italians, Germans, Anglo-Caribbeans, and other immigrant populations from all around the world. There is, however, a fourth pillar of Latin American society, one which has largely maintained a low profile for centuries, however is widely influential behind the scenes. I am referencing, of course, the incredibly large Middle Eastern population in many Latin American countries, which have been around for longer than many care to keep track of, and it would surprise many to learn the robust and sprawling nature of this community, which has become heavily entrenched in mainstream Latin American society, yet at the time remains hidden in plain sight. Essentially, Latin America has had links to the civilizations of the Middle East and North Africa ever since the first Spaniards landed on North American soil in 1492, seeing how the countries of Spain and Portugal, or at least the territory they encompassed, were once very closely linked to North Africa, seeing as to how they were actually incorporated in a part of many Islamic caliphates from as early as the 8th century AD, and they had a presence in the Iberian Peninsula for almost 800 years before the last of the Iberian Moors were finally driven out of Europe. And not to mention that Iberia has had relations with North Africans since antiquity, from the Carthaginians to the Romans. The Iberian Moors left many aspects of their culture on mainstream Spanish and Portuguese culture through architecture, vocabulary, and genetics, seeing as to how Iberians on average have around 2 to 10% North African or Middle Eastern admixture, mostly from the Moors that remained in the region and converted to Catholicism and intermarried with Castilians and others. This is especially apparent today in the people of southern Portugal, Andalusia, Spain's most southern region, and in the Canary Islands, which have a bit of a different history, with the native Ganch people being descended from ancient North African Berbers. However, they were completely absorbed into the new Canarian population, dominated by immigrants from the mainland of Spain. Also of note is the formerly large Sephardic Jewish population of Iberia, who of course have their origins in Israel and the Levant region, and were scattered throughout the Mediterranean by the Romans a couple thousand years ago, contributing to the large Jewish diaspora today. Many of these Muslims, known as Moriscos and Jews, were expelled from Iberia during the Inquisition of the 15th century, with most heading to North Africa, although many converts or conversos were able to flee to Spain and Portugal's colonies in the New World, oftentimes blending into the society and identifying as peninsulares to take full advantage of the casta system, and their descendants in Latin America today could number far more than anticipated, easily in the tens of millions, although their hidden nature makes it impossible to know without DNA testing or tracing back surnames. Although this does show Latin America's deep connections with the Middle East and North African regions, this video is actually going to cover the more recently migrated communities from the Middle East, specifically those of Levantine Arab ancestry, who over the centuries have significantly impacted Latin American culture. Mid to large-sized minorities of ethnic Arabs from the regions of Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria inhabit almost every single Hispanic American country, as well as the sole Lusophone country of Brazil, and they've become an important addition to Latino society today. Immigration of Arabs began around the mid to late 1800s, with the first Lebanese traders arriving en masse in large port cities of Brazil around 1860, although occasional migration of Arabs to various Latino countries like Argentina or Chile were recorded even before 1850, shortly after the waves of independence movements that swept through Latin America. Because the Levant was historically a part of the Ottoman Empire, most Arabs who arrived in Latin America in the 19th century were classified as Turks by nationality, despite only a tiny proportion of Ottoman immigrants actually being of the Turkish ethnicity. And during the period of European colonialism in the Levant after World War II, Syrian and Lebanese immigrants arrived on French passports instead of Ottoman ones, although they were clearly seen as distinct from French immigrants. The Lebanese Civil War of the 70s and 80s, which is notorious for being one of the most lengthy and violent in the Arab world, taking the lives of around 10% of the Lebanese population over a period of 15 years, was the catalyst for yet another large-scale wave of immigration to Latin America, seeing nearly 100,000 migrants headed for Latino countries in only a few years. In the early race-based class system of Latin American society, they were neither rejected nor completely accepted by these various governments, most of which desired immigrants from Western European countries. Early Arab immigrants were almost entirely Christian, and even then many Orthodox or Muslim immigrants converted to Catholicism upon arrival in these countries, knowing the inherent disadvantage of being a Muslim in a society with deep-seated distrust of Muslim communities. And early Arab immigrants were generally treated the same way as any European immigrant community, and were able to assimilate into Latino society with ease, no doubt in part due to their racially ambiguous appearance, able to integrate and marry into the white, mestizo, mulatto, or pardo communities. Arabs did occasionally clash with other Latinos, such as the Curitiba riot in southern Brazil in 1959, where many shops owned by Arab immigrants were looted or destroyed due to a conflict with local police. Although many of the early immigrants from the Levant were wealthy merchants and traders, very many more had very little, if nothing, to their names upon arriving on Brazilian or Mexican or Colombian shores, with many mistakenly believing that they were headed for the United States when they boarded passenger ships headed for America. However, they made the best for themselves in this new land, quickly becoming one of the most affluent groups in Latin America. Arab Latinos set up their own shops, restaurants, and the occasional farms, although for the most part clung to large cities such as Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Santiago, or Mexico City. Notable Arab Latin Americans include Carlos Slim, a Mexican billionaire of Lebanese descent, Michel Temer, current Brazilian president of Lebanese descent, along with 7 other former Latin American presidents of Arab ancestry, including Carlos Menem of Argentina and Julio Ayala of Colombia, and currently over 10% of the Brazilian parliament has Arab ancestry. Because of the low-profile nature of these Arab Latino communities, no one really knows just how many Arabs are in each specific country, and especially since many might have partial Arab ancestry and might not even be aware of it, a precise enumeration is thus impossible, although I've compiled a plethora of sources to get the most accurate rundown on this particular demographic. All in all, there are a combined 10 to 20 million people of Arab descent in all Latin American countries, with a median estimate of about 17 million, which is far and away more than any other region on the planet outside of their native homeland, outnumbering those in Europe, South Asia, and the United States. This includes around 10.6 million Lebanese, 5.2 million Syrian, 1.1 million Palestinian, and a much smaller amount from other nationalities such as those of Egyptian, Maghrebi, or Iraqi origin. Compared to the population of their home nations, their numbers are fairly spectacular, particularly the Lebanese community, which is nearly twice as large as the country of Lebanon today, quite comparable to the large diasporas of many Western European nations. Likewise, estimates on religious affiliation vary greatly, but it is certain that the percentage of Christians for Latin American Arabs is far higher than in the Middle East, with 70 to 80% of Arabs in Latin America being Christian today, while only 10 to 20% are Muslim, and possibly even lower than this, as the Brazilian census counted less than 100,000 Muslims in the entire country in 2010, although independent sources claim 500,000 to as high as 1.5 million. Catholics, specifically Maronites, are the largest sect of Latino Arabs at around 53%, 22% are Eastern Orthodox, such as the Greek Melkites, and only 4% are Protestant, while the Muslim community is split between about 2/3 Sunni and 1/3 Shia, while there's also a modestly sized Druze population of around 150,000. This means that around 6 out of 10 Arab Christians in the world currently live in Latin America, and this really does help to answer the conundrum of where the bulk of Christians in the Middle East disappeared to since the 19th century, seeing as to how Lebanon was over 70% Christian, Syria 20%, and Palestine over 15% by the beginning of the 20th century. However, since then, the proportion of Christians, especially in Palestine, have dropped dramatically. As a consequence of their swift integration and assimilation into Latino society, there are only 2 to 4 million speakers of Arabic in the region today, as the younger generations usually speak only Spanish or Portuguese, similar to that of the Japanese Latino population, and even most of the elderly Arab population has only a rudimentary grasp on the Arabic language, although Arabic slang is very often incorporated into everyday speech. The largest numbers of Arabs in Latin America is without a doubt located in Brazil, numbering around 5 to 10 million, giving it a larger Arab population than several countries in the Arab world, and others with Arab populations above 2% include Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, and Honduras, although in some areas like the city of Barranquilla in northern Colombia, up to 20% of the population has some Arab blood. Although rates of emigration back to their home countries is very low, a substantial number of Arab Latinos have also been migrating to the United States in recent years, where the general widespread misinformation surrounding Latino identity in American pop culture clashes with the reality that Latinos are an incredibly diverse group of people and not a monolithic, homogeneous race and culture as many would have you believe. The Arab population of Latin America is a very unique and fascinating population, along with the pre-existing influence from the Middle East and North Africa in Iberian society, just goes to show the link between Middle Eastern and Latino societies, and not to mention that the bulk of the Christian population of the Levant, especially Lebanese Maronites, have varying degrees of Western European admixture, so in a way they're going full circle by migrating back into a Christian European-based society. Please let me know your thoughts on the Arab Latino community made up of Lebanese, Palestinians, and Syrians. And as always, thank you so much for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Mason. That was a lot of good information to process. I would be glad to answer anyone's questions on further details surrounding that. But I want to highlight some push and pull factors. And, Mason alluded to them. Cecilia Baeza alludes to them in her discussion with the Institute for Palestine Studies, run by Yusuf Moner. She also discusses it in her piece, Between Assimilation and Long Distance Nationalism. Substitute the word assimilation for integration for those who associate a pejorative connotation with assimilation. Anyway, it's important to look at a couple factors when you're looking at the push and the pull. So the majority of the Arabs who came into Latin America, the first waves, and I pluralize waves because really the waves up until the recent waves, which we will explore in a little bit, were Christian Arabs. They could assimilate into Latin culture given the religious similarities. Now, granted, many of the Christian Arabs, the Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians, were a mix of Maronite Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox churches. A small number were Coptic Christians, mainly from Egypt, but larger numbers of Orthodox Christians and Catholics. There was a slight difference in religion, but an integratable difference. You see many Orthodox Christians, to fit into Latin society, did convert to Catholicism. That is why you see lots of folks who have links to the Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox churches, say in Bethlehem in Palestine, but are also Catholic in Latin America. So that has been seen, that has been noted. Now, he highlighted the point about there being more Lebanese Arabs in Brazil than there are, or more Lebanese Arabs in Latin America than there are in Lebanon. You want me to give you an astonishing fact related to the Palestinian diaspora? So the population in Chile, in the nation of Chile, of folks from the three towns of Bethlehem, Beit Sahur, and Beit Jalla are larger than those populations in the hometowns right now. In El Salvador, they have more people from Bethlehem than Bethlehem has in Bethlehem, who are Bethlehem natives. Bethlehem, in English, pronounced Bethlehem. Just to clarify for those who are asking me, what's Bethlehem? Okay, so there's that. There's also the Brazilian kibbeh you guys have to check out. It draws on elements of Brazilian and Arab culture, and that's the proof to the integration and the long-term presence of Arab culture in society in places like Brazil. So now let's move on to political implications. So we see a few things that we have to look at. The first, specifically with the Palestinian Chileans, is successful navigation into leading political movements in Chile. So Salvador Allende was a socialist, a left-leaning Chilean leader, democratically elected, and he was implementing socialist policies. Now, that meant that the wealthy merchant class of Palestinians in Santiago and elsewhere in Chile were their textile industries were being nationalized, were being basically captured by the Chilean government under Salvador Allende. So Cecilia Baeza looks in her scholarly piece between assimilation and long distance nationalism on how the Palestinian communities were in fact negatively impacted by the socialist policies implemented by Salvador Allende. So there were many Palestinian Christians who were instrumental in supporting Pinochet's ascension to power, frankly violent ascension. So let's be clear, Allende, it is reported based on thorough research, did commit suicide. There were theories going around that he was murdered, and there were even theories going around that he may have been murdered by members of the elite who were potentially Palestinian Chilean members of the elite wealthy class. But the conclusion is that he did in fact commit suicide, but that does not absolve the Palestinian Chilean community from being active in removing him and putting Pinochet in power. Now, Pinochet did grant these wealthy Palestinian Chileans their textile industries back. But the funny thing is, with Pinochet's neoliberal policies, the textile industry did leave Chile, and those wealthy merchants had to find different sectors of the economy to pursue. And that's why a lot of them ended up in commerce and banking and other high caliber sectors of the Chilean economy. So find that interesting, right? Call that karma, whatever you want to call that. I personally am a socialist, but I could see how socialist policies were not in favor of private mandates or private ownership of companies. So that did not go well with the affluent Palestinian Chileans. Now, let's jump on over to the Sandinistas getting support from Yasser Arafat and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PFLP, and PLO, and then also from fronts like the PFLP that had strong links to Chile, for example. So we saw that with the British Mandate of Palestine, and later with the Israeli establishment of the Israeli state in 1948, al-Nakba, and the 1967 Israeli illegal occupation of further territories of Palestine. There was activism to get these Latin American countries, most notably Chile, to host and bring displaced Palestinians and refugees. And this is why there were strong links between Latin America and the Palestine Liberation Organization. But were stronger ideological ties to the left in Latin America because of this anti-imperialism sentiment. However, it is worth noting that even on the right, there was pro-Palestine sentiment, because many of the folks in right-leaning circles were Palestinian or of Palestinian descent, and were benefiting from neoliberal policies because they were, like we said earlier, merchants and wealthy business owners. So it's complex, it's nuanced, to say the least, in discussing Palestinian involvement in politics in Latin America. And let's note, when there was many nations who had to vote on the partition plan in 1947-48, which gave 55.5% of the land to Israel and the remaining to a future undetermined Palestinian state, most Latin American countries sided with the Zionist movement in establishing a state of self-determination for Israel. So let's say 33 countries voted in favor of the establishment of this state given the partition. 13 voted against, 10 abstained. Of the 33 countries that voted in favor, I believe it was between 10 and 13 that were Latin American countries. So they were, 10 of them. So they were instrumental in implementing or making this partition go through, and 10 abstained. So, in alternate history, if we were to say those 10 voted with Palestine and the other 10 were persuaded to do so, it would have shifted the whole course of history, or to vote against the partition. And that's not to argue against the partition. That's just saying, it's not that the Latin American region has been consistently, against the establishment of the state of Israel, but with Israeli firms and Israeli companies playing proxy to the United States during the Cold War in Latin America, aiding the right, for example, in Chile under Pinochet, and in other instances, fighting against the Sandinistas, for example. You see that the left, you see that the left,
Duration, 0 hours, 26 minutes.
yeah,
Kevin.
you see that the left in Latin America was very, I wouldn't want to say offended, but felt like Israel was on the opposite side of their goals. And so when you saw the rise of many left-wing governments, you saw severing of ties or soiling of ties with Israel, such as Cuba in the 1970s, and Bolivia and Venezuela. And then you more recently started seeing center or center-right or right-wing governments even condemning Israel's actions, saying the 2014 siege on Gaza, because of the substantial Palestinian communities in those countries. Some of the largest marches against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the horrible mistreatment of the people of Gaza in the open-air prison known as Gaza, they were condemned because there were massive rallies in Santiago. There was massive rallies in Bolivia. There were in Santa Cruz in Bolivia. There were massive rallies elsewhere of the Palestinian diaspora. So those are many examples of how nuanced, how complex, how multi-layered the subject of politics is with the Palestinian community in Latin America. We didn't even get to the Palestinian community in Latin America advocating for the right of return, haqq al-awda, for Palestinians, even before 1948, before Nakba, the ones who had left and couldn't go back under the British Mandate in 1936. Cecilia Baeza does a good job of highlighting that in her discussion with the Institute for Palestine Studies. But I want to give one very specific example of the role of Palestinians culturally and specifically politically in one Latin American country. Why so many Palestinians live in El Salvador? Let's ask and answer that question, hopefully.
Latin America is home to the biggest population of Palestinians outside of the Arab world, and around 1/5 of them live in the small Central American country of El Salvador.
Aquí no estamos hablando, por ejemplo, de una comunidad monetaria en El Salvador. No somos parte integrada en el país. Somos una comunidad grande, salvadoreños de origen palestino.
And many Palestinian Salvadorans come from just one part of Palestine.
La mayor parte de la migración palestina a El Salvador fueron gente de la ciudad de Belén.
Bethlehem is home to around 29,000 inhabitants. Though exact numbers are unknown, There are claims that almost 100,000 people of Palestinian descent live in El Salvador. There are more Palestinians in El Salvador than Bethlehem now. But how did they all get there?
El abuelo de mi papá nació en Palestina, igual que mi abuelo, y ellos emigraron a El Salvador a finales del año 1920-22, por ahí.
Palestinians came to El Salvador starting in the late 19th century.
Empezó esta migración durante un poco antes también de la Primera Guerra Mundial por razones económicas y las dificultades el que vivía la gente bajo el dominio turco.
Since they arrived with Turkish Ottoman passports, Salvadorans call these newcomers Turcos or Turks. The term Turco persists to this day and sometimes carries a negative connotation.
Fue la palabra turco en aquel entonces muy pesada, daba pena, daba vergüenza, porque la sociedad alta del país lo consideraba como gente de nivel bajo, y fuimos discriminados.
Palestinians in El Salvador face significant institutional racism and xenophobia, especially from criollos, or the elite of European descent. In 1921, a change to Salvadoran immigration law classified Chinese and Arab people as pernicious. And in 1933, dictator Maximiliano Hernández Martínez enacted an immigration law that banned the arrival of black people, Asian people, and new immigrants from Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, or Turkey, generally known as Turcos. 3 years later, the government went even further, banning Chinese and Arab people from opening new businesses to protect national interests. Palestinian Salvadorans were badly affected by the law because many of them were innovative business people. Today, many prominent companies in El Salvador are owned by Palestinian Salvadorans. Most Palestinian Salvadorans don't speak Arabic and have fully assimilated into Salvadoran society, but they still celebrate their roots. For Nilsa Saka, she preserves her Palestinian heritage through food.
Me recuerda cuando nos reuníamos con mi mamá, con mi papá, sentados en la mesa, todos disfrutando, que mi mami hacía musaca, que mi papá le pedía que le hiciera el fatay.
She now runs a restaurant in the town of Santa Tecla named Teklebab.
Bueno, el restaurante es un restaurante fusión árabe-turco. Pues en realidad son recetas familiares, es una ascendencia palestina por parte de mi papá. Sí costó un poco llegar a un equilibrio para que el paladar del salvadoreño se adaptara a la gastronomía árabe. Muchos sabores eran como muy fuertes, por ejemplo el ajo es una cantidad bastante grande de ajo que se utiliza normalmente, o incluso no están mucho acostumbrados a utilizar el yogur en receta.
Simon Khoury is a former president of the Salvadoran Palestinian Association and committee member of Club Árabe, a social club for Salvadoran Palestinians that began in the 1950s.
Tenemos un club que orgullosa mucho y lo consideramos en nuestro nicho, donde la comunidad pasa muy buenos tiempos juntando en actividades.
Simon isn't your average Salvadoran Palestinian. He was actually born and raised in Palestine.
Llegué aquí a El Salvador en 1980. Casualidad yo conocí a mi esposa allá.
His wife, like many Palestinian Salvadorans, still maintains ties with the homeland a century later.
No hay ninguna familia, ningún apellido de origen palestino que está en el país que no tiene una conexión de sangre directa allá en Palestina. Así la relación es impactante, la relación es de siempre.
But Bethlehem, the ancestral homeland for many Palestinian Salvadorans, is threatened by illegal Israeli settlements.
Estamos hasta el momento con aquellas heridas y la injusticia del mundo de crear un Estado israelí en nuestra tierra y obligar a la mayor parte palestina de emigrar.
The Israel-Palestine conflict plays out in public spaces in San Salvador, El Salvador's capital. Here's a plaza dedicated to the State of Israel, and here's a plaza dedicated to Palestine just 200 meters away, and is dedicated to the occupied Palestinian territories. And on Jerusalem Avenue in San Salvador, there's a plaza honoring Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, which the Israeli embassy has protested. Despite the large Palestinian population, Israel has historically exerted a lot of influence on El Salvador through the strong relationship it's had with the far-right governments that have ruled El Salvador for much of its history. From 1975 to 1979, the years leading up to El Salvador's 12-year-long civil war, 83% of El Salvador's military imports came from Israel. Israelis also helped train ANSESAL, the secret police that would lay the foundation for death squads during El Salvador's war.
Durante la guerra aquí en El Salvador tuvimos un problema de estallar una bomba y fuimos casi con mucha razón obligados a quedar en el país porque salió mi señora embarazada, pero no me arrepiento. Aquí ya tengo raíces, tengo hijos, tengo nietos. Yo vine joven para acá y ya ahorita me pinta mi pelo aquel color de la vejez, pero con todo amor a un país que abrió las puertas para nosotros.
Palestinian Salvadorans have shaped the country's modern-day politics. El Salvador's first president of Palestinian origin was the far-right-leaning Antonio Saca. When he won the 2004 election, he beat Shafiq Handal, another Salvadoran of Palestinian origins from the leftist party FMLN. Handal had been a prominent guerrilla leader who negotiated the 1992 peace accords that concluded El Salvador's civil war. Upon his death, Handal was buried with the flags of Palestine, El Salvador, and the Communist Party. Nayib Bukele won El Salvador's 2019 elections to become the country's second leader of Palestinian descent. He even played up his Bethlehem roots at Christmas.
Mi abuela nació en Belén, por eso cada Navidad celebrábamos en su casa con toda la familia.
But despite his Palestinian identity, he maintained a cozy relationship with Israel. In 2015, when he was mayor of San Salvador, the Israeli ambassador to El Salvador called him a partner for collaboration. In 2018, Bukele went on an Israeli government-sponsored trip to the International Mayors Conference in Israel. El Salvador still struggles with violence, a legacy of its civil war. People are fleeing in the thousands in caravans. And so, Salvadoran Palestinians represent the human rights struggles of two peoples on opposite sides of the world.
El palestino está luchando también más que esto, una guerra sobre su cultura, sobre su gente, sobre su existencia. El salvadoreño aquí también está revolucionando, está luchando por una mejor vida, por tener derechos igualitarios, que no hay discriminaciones sociales, que no hay diferencias económicas.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Did you know there's actually more Palestinians next door in Honduras? Let us know what you think in the comments below.
Thank you so much. So, and I will say what he was going to say right at the end, that there are even more Palestinians to be found in Honduras, Honduras next door to El Salvador. So there's a few very important points brushed upon. Number one, emphasizing the majority of Salvadoran Palestinians are from Bethlehem. Jerusalem Avenue in San Salvador shows the complexity of the politics of the Palestinians in El Salvador. You got a plaza dedicated to Israel and a plaza dedicated to Palestine, 200 meters apart from each other. But I think the important thing here is the parallel of the situation of the nation of El Salvador right now, and the plight of the Palestinians over the past 100 years, whether it was under the colonial mandate of British Palestine or the Israeli occupation and the post-1967 illegal occupation, the settlements being established by Israeli settlers in places like Bethlehem, for example, and how there is that connection. the struggles, the resistance against imperialism in ways. In Latin America, it's American influence. We saw in the Cold War how the United States wanted to ensure communism stayed out of Latin America and went to any measures possible. And the Soviet Union wanted to make sure communism stayed in Latin America. But the United States had a higher degree, a greater depth of vested interest because Latin America was in their backyard. The Palestinians feel that the current occupation of Israel, the illegal Israeli occupation post 1967, and so on, is just a modern day form of colonialism. And the way that Zionism has manifested itself also is a modern day form of colonialism. So there's that parallel. The other parallel, and we don't see this per se so much in El Salvador, as we may see it in, say, Mexico City or Santa Cruz, Bolivia. I know from personal experience, Santa Cruz, Bolivia is kind of like Ramallah in Palestine, basically the whole setup. And large community of Palestinians in Santa Cruz are from Ramallah, funny enough. Mexico City is a really big and congested city, also kind of like Ramallah, or think of Cairo in Egypt, where many Palestinians have flocked to as well. So you would see many Palestinians who actually moved from Cairo, Egypt, or Beirut, Lebanon, to Mexico City when they received that privilege. Not many have, because they've been perpetually holding refugee status, but the few that were privileged to do so were able to find a way out. So that is the first waves. Now, since the wars in Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, other nations where Palestinians have sought refuge after the Al-Nakba and after 1967, were also areas that fell under war, civil war, or else war, in Iraq's case, the American invasion, the fall of the brutal dictator Saddam Hussein. The Palestinians were forced into a double refugee situation, as Leonardo Chiaquet highlights in his article examining the Palestinian communities that were resettled in Brazil from the Refuge refugee camps in Jordan, who had fled Iraq because most of them had worked with or in collaboration or in support of the Saddam Hussein administration. So they had to flee post the fall of Saddam Hussein, because otherwise they were at the risk of persecution. So many of them found themselves at the Refuge camp or the 10th camp in Jordan, and or in Syria even, some of them. They had to then escape that predicament, and Brazil welcomed them. But the struggles only started when they arrived in Brazil. As Arlette, Leal, Adriana, Palomera, and here, I want to make sure I get their names correct, the researchers. Journal of International Migration, Protection and Refugees in Brazil and Chile, the Case of Palestinian Refugees, an analysis from the model of economic and cultural adaptation. Arlette, Leal, Carmen, Norambuena, and Adriana, Palomera, published August 2019. They did a research that used Michael Lanfear's model of integration and adaptation, refugee adaptation, to look at how the Palestinians fared in Brazil after 109 of them arrived in Brazil in 2007, and 116 of them arrived in Chile in 2008. Following resettlement programs, because both Chile and Brazil have a history of welcoming folks with open arms in terms of policy, right? But they look at the models and highlight that Chile, a much smaller nation of 17 million, the arrivals had more of a proportional impact, a higher proportional impact than those who arrived in Brazil, a nation of 200 million. Chile has had a really rich Christian Palestinian community, whereas Brazil has had more of a Lebanese and Syrian community. But the new arrivals are Palestinian Muslims. So as Leonardo Chioquet looks at in his research of specifically the Palestinian Muslims who arrived in Brazil, there were multiple problems of naturalization and lack of information on how they would integrate, problems of difficulty with language integration and language lessons. And there was this sense of religious discrimination. So it wasn't a cheery picture. Neither was it for the original waves of Christian Palestinians who arrived. They were Orthodox when the majority of Latin America was Catholic. So this, I think, is maybe a sharper jump because Muslims in a Christian, predominantly Christian society. However, it's a jump nonetheless. So we want to make sure we highlight that there are difficulties, although we would love to be so fascinated by this migration pattern of Arabs in Latin America, it's still an uphill battle. So to get an idea of waves of Palestinians in Chile, for example, let's look at a gentleman whose father came from Bethlehem in 1986 and how his story has impacted and inspired Chile to welcome more Palestinian refugees. While him and his family might be Christian, they're still Palestinian, so they drew that line to the Palestinian Muslims who were leaving Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere and arriving in Chile in 2007, 2008, 2009, and so on. So let's look at the video. It has a beautiful
35-year-old Palestinian Johnny Abu-ElHawa oversees every detail of the pita bread produced here every day at this branch of the Fufu Bakery, a business his father opened in the occupied West Bank town of Beit Jala in 1986. But this is not the Middle East, but Santiago, Chile.
I came to Chile 5 years ago because at home there is too much war, too much oppression from Israel. Here we are free. Everything is pretty. The doors are open for us to come and to really live.
Palestinians began migrating to Chile in the early 1900s, mainly from the Christian cities of Bethlehem, Beit Jala, and Beit Sahur. They've grown to become not only the largest Palestinian community outside of the Middle East, but also extremely prosperous and influential in industry and politics. As a community, they are fierce advocates of Palestinian statehood, with the support of most Chileans, as well as the government. Daniel Hadwe, the high-profile mayor of a municipality that includes Patronato, or Little Palestine, explains why Chilean Palestinians remain so attached to their roots.
The fact that we are part of a nation that is in danger of being exterminated, that's subjected to political genocide on the part of Israel, makes us united and cohesive in the defense of Palestine. It's why we can't forget it.
And keeping that memory alive is a new generation of Palestinian Muslim refugees who came here from refugee camps in Syria exactly 1 decade ago. Unlike in most Arab countries, Chile was quick to grant them citizenship and a passport. And not surprisingly, many of them too have settled here in Patronato. Fardos Melhem and her husband Amir admit it was hard at first. But now, as they treat us to coffee and sweets from their shop, they're happy to talk about their new life with their 2 children.
I have Chilean friends and Arab friends too. Now we celebrate Chilean and Arab customs. Here your religion isn't an issue at all. I am treated well wherever I go.
Santiago has a popular football club called Palestine and a school with the same name. And while more than 13,000 kilometers separate Chile from the Middle East, here both the old and new Palestinian diaspora seems to have found a home that respects their culture and embraces their cause, as few other countries have done. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
So it seems like in Santiago, in Chile, the general policy was to welcome these folks. Pardon me, Johnny Abu Reyes was from Bechala, but his family appears to be Christian, but the family of Amir and Ferdos al-Malham appear to be Muslim. So the solidarity spans religion in this example. One thing I will say about this source, and it only has 2 minutes to present itself, sort of alluded to the ability to integrate for these Muslim refugees who have fled, who are double refugees, as Leonardo Sciocchi highlighted, who have fled or have been displaced from Palestine, found themselves in Syria or Iraq. And then from Syria, the civil war broke out. So they had to find themselves somewhere else, and they ended up in Chile. The integration process is really not that easy. So a decade is a long time. So I think it's important just to emphasize that. But it's also important to realize that there's a great deal of open-armed solidarity. And you see this in Chile, you see this in Brazil, but you also see the cultural differences of the Palestinians who came and integrated into society 150 years ago, and the ones who are arriving now, who have lived another century in an ever-evolving Middle Eastern context that looks different from the context of 150 years ago. And the Latin American context looks different than it did 150 years ago. But with the ever-evolving situation of both contexts, it shows the global impact of how the struggles of Latin America and the struggles of the Middle East has been able to cultivate this solidarity movement. With that being said, there are still uphill battles, like Odette Yidi highlighted in Colombia, where the Palestinian community kind of integrated in a way where they maybe were encouraged to forget their roots in ways. And so you have many Palestinian Colombians who don't even know much about Palestine. And I think you're seeing this revival movement all across Latin America. You know, as Tahia Abdel Nasser highlights in the journal article at the American University in Cairo, you have Lina Meruane, who is a writer in Chile who wrote a beautiful memoir in Spanish, talking about becoming Palestinian and finding her roots in Palestine, and really not being able to find her roots because she went to someone, Maryam Abu-Awad, and found her in Beit Lahem in that area and asked her if she could, if there's a relationship between Abu-Awad and Meruane. And there, Maryam Abu-Awad was not able to trace that link, or is maybe specified that there was in fact no link. So this inspiration to rediscover the roots is what we're seeing of the fourth and fifth generation Palestinians in Latin America. The same can be applied to Nathalie Handal, who spent time in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, and is now writing in the US, in the United States, and has written some beautiful poetry about back home in Palestine. So Tahia Abdel Nasser does an effective job in their journal article highlighting how there are different forms of art people are using to rediscover their Palestinian roots, whether it's all the good food in Bancaria, Colombia, whether it's, as Odette Yidi highlighted, or whether it's Lina Meruane or Nathalie Handal writing about their homeland of Palestine. There's lots of hunger to rediscover. I think there's a couple other points we should take away from this global phenomenon. The first being how the culture of the two parts of the world, of Latin America and the Arab world, are blending together very generally, but then also seeing how the Lebanese communities use their culture in Latin America and their influence, how the Syrians use their influence and culture in Latin America, and how the Palestinians use their culture. So we see in Palestine and in Syria, there are political crises going on right now, and there is a demand from both Syrian communities and Palestinian communities to constantly accept refugees from Syria and Palestine. In Latin America, we saw the same with the Lebanese communities during the Lebanese Civil War, but it has been more constant and it has been more consistent amongst the Palestinian communities in Latin America, solely because the context of the conflict, of the struggle, of the occupation going on in Palestine has been so much more long-term. So why does Latin America stand in solidarity with Palestine? Let's look at another 2-minute clip that will answer that question for us. Thank you very much. Wow, so solidarity between Palestine and Latin America is very real, as we can see over here. And the movements continue in nations like Chile, Argentina, and elsewhere, Bolivia, whether it was under Evo Morales or the current administration, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, or even the current administration, Nicolas Maduro, and others. I highlighted leftist examples, stand in solidarity with Palestine, even Cuba. But you even see other nations. You see Colombia suspending or questioning their ties with Palestine. You see Chile questioning their ties with Palestine, even under neoliberal or right-leaning administrations. So whether it's startups like Invest Palestine that draws a link between investments between the Palestinian community in Chile and the Palestinian community back home in Beit Jala or Beit Lahem or Beit Sahur, or other startups, or whether it's the food and bancaria, Colombia, or Brazilian Kibbin, Sao Paulo, or whether it's Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese having high influential authority positions in Latin America, or even leaders, presidents like El Salvador's current Nayib Bukele. I know he's Palestinian, but he does take some pro-Israel stances. Or previous Salvadoran far-right leader, Tony Saka, who's Palestinian, or other leaders, really. You can see how Palestine and the Arab world in general, the Levantine Arab world in general, has such a tight-knit context and story with Latin America, whether it's the waves in the 1860s or some as early as 1850, or the new immigrants or the new refugees who are being resettled in Brazil, in Chile, and elsewhere. There's always a story to be told of Palestinian perseverance, Palestinian integration, and Palestinian relationship and context with Latin America. And I think the title that Cecilia Baeza put into her research, Between Assimilation and Long Distance Nationalism, just touches the tip of the iceberg of this long and intriguing and beautiful story to be told, with its ups, its downs, its rough patches, and its beautiful culminations. So I'm very happy to have taken some time to talk about such a global phenomenon of diaspora with y'all. And please feel free to reach out to me with any comments, questions, or concerns. And this conversation and its true intricacies should not stop. It's so fascinating to see how many Palestinians have found their way to Latin America due to any struggle story, whether it's Christian marginalization or persecution under the Ottoman Empire, economic downturns, a required military conscription during the Young Turks era, Young Turks Revolution, the British Mandate of Palestine, Al-Nakba, the 1967 occupation, or the current civil war in Syria and collapse of Iraq. There always seems to be waves of Palestinians finding their way to a second home in Latin America. Spending time in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, I was able to learn how the Palestinian community really established its roots and its pillars and really made Santa Cruz little Ramallah, or you even see the same in Mexico City, in Chiapas State in Mexico, Cancun, and elsewhere where there are many Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians. I wanted to make sure I highlighted, so before I forget, some important details here. So we see that, you know, as we brought up earlier, the newer waves of Palestinian immigrants, particularly the ones leaving Syria, Iraq, and other nations, are Muslim, whereas the first waves were Christian. So how does that necessarily impact the relation between the third and fourth generation Palestinian Latinos, or the Palestinians who live in Latin America, who are predominantly Christian, and the new arrivals who are Muslim? Well, you know, Leonardo Schiochet, in his study about the outcasts among undesirables, where he looks at the struggles of the double refugee case of Palestinians who were refugees in Iraq and now in turn, having been kicked out of Iraq, end up in Brazil, find that the Palestinians who arrived in Brazil, Palestinian Muslims, were really so unfortunately demoralized by the approach of Brazilian society, including the descendants of Arab Christians who lived in southern Brazil with them, that they kind of felt let down because they weren't given language courses, but also because they felt like they couldn't freely and openly practice their faith. So they felt lost even amongst other Arabs who were not necessarily Muslim, but they were Arab. They felt like it was harder, the Muslim Arabs, the new arrivals, felt like it was harder for them to integrate with the Christian Arabs having already integrated for over a century. And this made it doubly complicated and doubly hard for the Muslim Palestinian smooth integration into Brazilian society. Furthermore, it was a situation where naturalization was not as easy as implied, and even those who were educated, their education in places like Handal were not recognized in Brazil. Furthermore, or moreover, you see that they feel like humanitarian aid or humanitarianism, as was described to them, proved to be more political than, it claimed, because humanitarianism claims to be apolitical, but in this case, the politics of Brazil, the nationalistic rhetoric amongst some Brazilians did dominate the conversation, even with the humanitarian reasons and bases for accepting refugees. So obviously the picture for Palestinians arriving in Latin America wasn't always bright and cheery, but I think I will, leave you guys with a good video. Obviously, I'll have some commentary on the other end, but a good video looking at how the Muslim communities are building themselves and how they are adapting for the Ramadan celebrations in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So here we'll watch a TRT World video that quickly looks at that. TRT World being from Turkey. TRT is a television station in Turkey. So without further ado, let's take a glance at Sao Paulo Ramadan celebrations.
Paulo is the industrial and financial capital of South America and attracts migrants from all over the world. Most of the city's mosques are in the Brass neighborhood, near the city center. Iyad Abu-Harbi runs a shawarma restaurant there, as he fasts during Ramadan.
Muito bem-vindo.
Iyad arrived in Brazil 3 years ago as a refugee from Syria. He says fasting helps remind him of those less fortunate.
Tudo é o ser humano.
Everyone is human, and we remember them during this time. When we fast, we remember the homeless, people in Syria, in the Middle East, in Brazil. It's a great thing to do for God.
Muslims first arrived in Brazil from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. A second wave of Lebanese and Syrian migrants came after. Today, less than 1% of Brazil's more than 200 million people are practicing Muslims, but the number is growing. Since the beginning of the war in Syria, Brazil has issued thousands of humanitarian visas to Syrians fleeing the war. Brazil's Muslim population has increased in recent years with the arrival of thousands of migrants from Syria, the Middle East and Africa. And with most of them settling in Sao Paulo, this year's Ramadan celebrations will be one of the most celebrated in the city's history. A short walk from Iyad's restaurant is the Brass Mosque, one of the oldest in Sao Paulo, founded by Lebanese migrants. With the evening call to prayer, Muslims gather at the mosque after breaking their fast. Imam Saeed Bilal says that with Islam being such a minority religion in Brazil, there are obvious challenges during fasting and Ramadan, but that overall, Brazil respects Islam.
Brazilian people understand differences in cultures, and the Brazilian Muslim here gets every right he deserves, just like any other person in Brazil.
The sunset finally puts the brakes on a long day's work at the restaurant, and Iyad breaks fast with fellow workers and friends. In a place far from home, but now close to his heart. Sam Cowie, TRT World, Sao Paulo.
Sorry about that. As we can see here, Sao Paulo is a bigger city in Brazil, so integration is a little easier. There's more diversity, and they look at the, or briefly allude to the history of Muslims in Brazil and in Latin America for many hundreds of years. We saw the same with conversos from Spain and Portugal, as the unspoken pillars of Latin America video talked about briefly as well earlier, such as Cristobal Colon. We're all familiar with Cristobal Colon from Spain, who was a Jewish individual who became a converso integrate and join the ranks of the Peninsulares in Latin America. We saw other Moriscos or Moors who were Muslims who became conversos as well, conversos for converts to Catholicism, where they would, under the Inquisition, integrate themselves with the Peninsulares. So there are roots of Muslims, Jewish people, and others. But I think the Muslim Palestinians specifically, I know this was an example of a Syrian refugee, but the Muslim Palestinian refugees could share in the same plight as the Syrian refugee example here, are feeling like they're arriving into a new context where they don't know Portuguese, or in other cases in Chile, Spanish. And, these are heavily Catholic or Christian countries, so they feel a little outside the context. But integration appears more possible in these globalized cities like Sao Paulo, which is the industrial and financial hub of South America, which means it also brings in activity globally. You have many Arab Gulf business people, Emirati, for example, or Qatari business people who have financial dealings in Sao Paulo, for example, many American business people and investors who have investments or financial dealings in Sao Paulo, and so on. So that explains why globalized cities like Sao Paulo, like Buenos Aires or Santiago de Chile will have more a smooth integration than the rural or sub-rural areas where some of the Palestinian Muslim refugees were settled in southern Brazil, near Santa Catarina or elsewhere. Grande do Sul, I think is the name of the province. I hope I'm not pronouncing it wrong. Have been able to settle. I did want to refer earlier, I was talking about Odette Yidi, talking about the Arab culture in Colombia. Most of the Palestinians in Colombia were of earlier waves were Christian, but there are many new Muslim Palestinian arrivals in Colombia, in Venezuela, including in the city I referenced earlier, Barranquilla, that's how it's pronounced, Barranquilla, Colombia, where you can get kibbeh and falafel and all the good grub. So there are Muslim Palestinians arriving in places, like I said, Bolivia, Venezuela, and elsewhere, Peru even, and integrating or trying to, with strength, trying to integrate into these societies. Whether it is the struggles that new Muslim Palestinian immigrants are facing, as highlighted by Leonardo Schiochet, or the complex history of Israel, Palestine, and Latin America's relationship, as highlighted by Ronaldo Monk from Dublin City of Dublin University College, or the Michael Lanphier model when applied to integration, economic and cultural adaptation for new Palestinian immigrants, comparing Chile and Brazil, as researched by Arlette, Leal et al. These are all comprehensive explanations of the complexities and diversity of the backstory and identity of Palestinians in Latin America, and how they will not be marginalized, as Salman Safavi highlights in his Middle East Monitor interview. So I guess, in conclusion, this is a very, complex issue, and it's not just a story of one people or another. It's a story of multiple different people with multiple different backgrounds, multiple different experiences and histories, experiencing intersectionality together. So hopefully this was a great presentation, and I guess thank you guys. Thank you for listening. I know I said that earlier, but in conclusion, hopefully we can learn more about this global, global diasporas are very interesting to study, whether they're the Palestinian ones, the Eastern European diasporas after, the horrifying situation during the Holocaust, or other diasporas as we're seeing around the world taking place right now from the Middle East, parts of Asia and elsewhere. So, in Africa and Latin America. And so the conversation doesn't stop here. So I guess in closing, I just want to go back and look at that map and really show, again, it was a map of Lebanese diaspora, but really show how these Arab communities worked in solidarity with each other. And in order not to step on each other's feet or impede upon each other's competition, they were sure to travel, the Palestinians were sure to travel to different regions so they won't impede upon the merchant work and the craftsmanship of the Lebanese in Brazil, in Ecuador, and elsewhere. Ecuador had a president, Bucaram, who was Lebanese, of Lebanese ancestry. Argentina had Carlos Mun'im of Syrian ancestry. El Salvador had two Palestinian ancestry presidents, Tony Saca and current Nayib Bukele. And there are many other examples of how the Arab community, the Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian communities, the Levantine communities, have integrated themselves into that society. Now, that was predominantly the Christian wave. Let's see how the new Muslim wave of refugees will integrate themselves and become pillars of the societies in Latin America that have opened the doors to them. There are many problems that need to be solved. Integration has to be smoother. So this is why this conversation should not end. And let's continue seeking out the solutions. So instead of highlighting the problems, let's identify them and find the solutions in the global context. Thank you all very much, and thanks for your patience with me. I hope this presentation was engaging, and I hope you all are more so enriched after having learned about the Palestine, Latin America, beautiful dichotomy overall. Thank you all very much, and peace out. Assalamu alaikum. Bye-bye.